Today's reading is taken from Exodus chapter 5 verse 22, and it can be found on page 62 of the Church Bibles. Moses returned to the Lord and said, "O Lord, why have you brought trouble upon these people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand he will drive them out of his country." God also said to Moses, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they lived as aliens. Moreover, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." Moses reported this to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragements and cruel bondage. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go, tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites go out of his country." But Moses said to the Lord, "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?" This is the word of the Lord.
I wonder if this image on the screen resonates with you at all. Last weekend I was driving to a friend's wedding, and I expected that most of my journey would be on the M1. Shortly after setting off, the sat-nav advised me that unless I wanted to spend an hour and a half sat in traffic on the motorway when the temperature outside was over 30 degrees, most of my journey was not, in fact, going to be on the M1, and I ended up taking a quicker route, but one closer to the second of those two images than the first. In fact, I can't even tell you where I drove. I got to where I needed to get to. Often, our expectations, or the expectations of others, are different from the reality. It might be a project at work or at home, one that was going to take 3 months and instead ends up taking 6, with all sorts of unexpected situations along the way. Or a particular life experience, having a child, losing a loved one, longing for a relationship. I first came across an image similar to this one on the screen when someone was sharing with me and expressing how it felt when they were recovering from illness. And they felt that people's expectations were that they would ask them how they are, and each day they'd be a little bit better than the day before. But the reality for them, they were trying to explain, was that some days were better and some days were worse, and there were new unexpected things to deal with along the way, not the straight line of recovery they felt people expected. And my experience is that we can also encounter this difference between our expectations, or the expectations of others, and the reality on our faith journeys too. We might expect that the more we go to church or read our Bibles or books about the Christian faith, the more answers we'll get, or the closer to God we'll feel. And actually, sometimes we end up with more questions, rather than our journey of faith being one of only increasing clarity. Sometimes there are seasons when things feel less clear. Now, I think Moses would have resonated with this image, and we're just going to go over where we've been so far in this sermon series. God had made a promise to Abraham, that's actually in Genesis 12, which he affirmed to Abraham's son Isaac and to Isaac's son Jacob, that he would make Abraham's descendants into a great nation, that they would be blessed, inherit the land God had promised them, and that he would be with them. However, at this point in the story, where we are this morning in Exodus, the Israelites are not in the promised land. The descendants of Abraham, they're enslaved in Egypt. So God has called Moses to be part of his rescue plan, to deliver the Israelites from their slavery. Now Moses hears God's call, but isn't sure he's the right person. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? That's chapter 3. What shall I tell them when they ask who sent me? Also in chapter 3. What if they do not believe me or listen to me? Chapter 4. I am not eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. That's chapter 4, verse 10. In response to this, God provided Moses with Aaron, who would speak to the people for Moses. So together, Moses and Aaron responded to God's call, and the elders of the Israelites, when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped. That's the end of chapter 4, where we finished last week. So far, so good. And last week, Sarah was helping us to think about how God calls and uses each of us with our strengths and our weaknesses, sometimes in the most unexpected of places and ways. However, things don't work out as Moses expected. Moses and Aaron, they go to speak to Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't let the Israelites go, and life gets significantly worse for the Israelites. No longer will they be supplied with straw to make bricks. They must gather the straw themselves. And the quota of bricks they need to make each day, well, that's going to remain exactly the same. Now they must work even harder, not just making the bricks, but gathering the straw as well as making the bricks. That's the first part of chapter 5. So God's got this rescue plan. Moses and Aaron are to be part of this plan to free God's people, the Israelites, and well, the Israelites are now more enslaved and oppressed than ever. And that's where our Bible reading this morning begins in chapter 5, verse 22. If you've got a phone with you or can grab the Bible under the seat, you might find it helpful to follow along. I think it's page 62. So chapter 5, verse 22. Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. Despite his initial reluctance, anxieties, and questions, it would appear that Moses was expecting things to be a little more plain sailing. Although Moses was the one who had doubts, and God has told him that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened and he won't let the people go, that's chapter 4, verse 21, Moses seems to have been expecting God's rescue plan to work out a bit more like the image on the left, and the reality seems to be a little bit more like the image on the right. So this morning I thought we might look at the reality of the situation for Moses, for the Israelite people, for Pharaoh, and for God, and then we'll think about what this passage might have to say to us about responding to God's call. So firstly, Moses. Moses, in our reading this morning, is questioning his calling. Things have not worked out as he expected, and he's wondering what's gone wrong. Whether what he thought God was calling him to do was not what God was actually calling him to do, I've responded to your call, God, and what's happened is more trouble. That's not what's meant to happen. Surely being obedient to God's call should result in a good outcome. And it hasn't. It's resulted in an awful outcome. Is this my fault? Is this God's fault? I think it's fair to say that this is probably where Moses was at, consumed by feelings of doubt and failure, confusion, and perhaps even a sense of feeling misled or let down by God. This wasn't how it was supposed to work out. Secondly, the Israelite people. They've initially responded by bowing down and worshipping when they heard from Moses that God was concerned for his people, end of chapter 4. But now in chapter 5, they are angry and discouraged. They're asking God to judge Moses and Aaron because, verse 21 of chapter 5, just before the start of our passage, you have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. The Israelites are understandably broken, crushed. They thought that God was going to rescue them through Moses and Aaron, and what's happened is they're being punished. Their already demanding work has become even harder, and their treatment harsher. When Moses speaks to the Israelites again in verse 9 of chapter 6, as God has instructed him to, the Israelites don't listen, understandably, because of their discouragement and harsh labour. What you said was going to happen hasn't going to happen. Why are we going to listen to you now? So that's the Israelite people. Thirdly, Pharaoh. Pharaoh has not just not responded to Moses and Aaron's request to free the Israelite people. He's gone further than this, and he's intensified his oppression of them. The reality is that signs and wonders have not been enough to change Pharaoh's heart. A different approach is needed, acts of judgment, as we're going to be looking at next week in chapter 7. And finally, God. Where is God in this situation? Well, God is reaffirming his call to Moses and restating his promises to rescue his people. God is with Moses, and God is with the Israelite people. God is reminding Moses of his power, of his mighty hand, verse 1 of chapter 6. It's not Moses versus Pharaoh. It is God through Moses and Aaron speaking to Pharaoh. And even Pharaoh's power doesn't compare to God's authority. It's not Moses versus Pharaoh, it's God through Moses speaking to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's power doesn't compare to God's authority. God remembers his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and God is committed to fulfilling his promises. Things may not be working out quite as Moses or the Israelite people expected or hoped or envisaged, but nothing about God's faithfulness to his promises has changed. The arrow's still pointing in the same direction, even if it's feeling a bit more like this image on the right. Nothing about God's faithfulness to his promises has changed. God could not be clearer about his rescue plan. Moses is to say to the Israelites, I will bring you out, I will free you, I will redeem you. That's verse 6 of chapter 6. In 3 different ways, God makes it clear that he will be faithful to his promise to rescue the Israelites. I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you. Although God may feel absent or distant at the present time, the people of Israel will come to know God through relationship with him. They will experience God at work in their lives, bringing them out of Egypt, and then they will both know God and know that they are known by God. Take a look at verse 7. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. God will work in their lives, bringing them out of slavery in Egypt. And then they will both know God and know that they are known by God. God will bring the people into the land promised to Abraham. In the example of Moses, we see that it's not just taking the decision to respond to God's call that can be challenging and demanding, but that faithfully following God can be challenging and demanding too. The questions and anxieties don't go away once Moses has said yes to God sending him. I wonder whether Moses had more fears and doubts at this point in the story in chapter 6 than when God first called Moses in chapter 3. I sometimes think that once I've had that initial back and forth with God about whether I'm going to do something, and once I've said the yes, then it will be okay. But actually, my experience is that it's often a journey of continuously saying yes to God. And whilst this might not sound like such great news, following God, it's going to get harder rather than easier. I think this is actually a good news. I think the example of Moses can be an encouragement to us. It challenges me in a really good way, as it reminds me not to doubt God's call or God's goodness the moment things are a bit more complicated or a bit more messy than expected. My instinct, and maybe this will be some of your instincts too, is to assume that if I'm being obedient to God and something's God's will, things will fall into place. And the moment something doesn't feel like it's going quite to plan, or maybe that means I've heard God wrong, or the call's wrong, or the vision's wrong, or God's not present. Sometimes as we reflect on where God is in a situation, God might be showing us something we need to pay attention to. Sometimes when a situation's uncomfortable, there is something we need to reconsider, or we may need to change direction. But sometimes it's just things being a little bit more complicated, or a little bit more messy, or happening a little bit more God's way and a little less our way. When life or following God for us as individuals and as a church community is feeling a little more like the image on the right and a little less like the image on the left, the example of Moses reminds us that God is faithful to his people and his promises, even in the most testing of times. Where we are, whether life and faith are feeling like the straight line, whether life and faith are meeting our expectations, or whether they're feeling like the squiggly line and the reality of our life journey or faith journey is very different from what we expected. Where we are, God is too. Where we are, God is too. Amen.